I'm going to follow time-honored precedent and stand as well. Um, so I'm not actually a geek. I've never programmed for a living. I'm kind of an observer of the tech scene, have been for a while. I didn't realize we'd dropped the HTML test to be able to be on the net. That was kind of cool. And what I'd like to do is build a little context. Pete asked me to look ahead, to look forward a little bit, which I love to do. So I'm going to be a little ambitious and try to state some broader context of where I think we might be. And let me start by saying that I think what's happening right now, what we're in the middle of, is that we're weaving a global brain. We're changing the fabric of community and communications. We're using these new tools in a way that I think will profoundly change the way we see each other, perceive each other, the way organizations perceive us, the way organizations interact. All these different sorts of things are actually going to change quite deeply. And I think we're sort of 20 or 30 years into what may be a 50 or 60-year process. So it's ugly right now. It's very chaotic, and all the tools are still in Tinker Toy parts on the floor, and people are assembling them in really nifty ways. But every time that somebody friends me on Facebook, or every time that somebody blogs about someone else's blog post or about mainstream media, or every time Dave Witzel posts on Twitter that something is happening in this room, which he's doing right now live, he's building a little neural connection. Okay, a friending is like a little neural pathway between two people, and it looks really trivial. So if you look on Facebook and you look at this mini feed thing, it's exhaust data. It looks really trivial. It looks like nonsense. But what all those things are is little filaments of connectivity between all of us that later on become the highways of actual communication and actual trust building over time. So I learned about Dave that he's good at live blogging, and so I start following him. So then later, when something really important happens, I might weight what he says more than what somebody else says. This is a little bit how a brain works locally inside one skull, except what's beginning to happen is we're connecting up brains between skulls. It's an inter-skull brain somehow. I just made that up. But I'm not trademarking it. I'm open sourcing it right now. So, I mean, yeah, exactly. Creative Commons, I realize it's also not very good. So I think we're in the middle of creating a global brain. And one of the things that lets us do this is this brand new phenomenon I refer to as persistence. And you could probably pick an easier word for it. But the notion here is that I can create something and I can leave it out in cyberspace and it persists. It stays there. I can walk away and go about my day. You know, Micha can write posts and do all kinds of interesting things. And then he goes and travels here and talks. And everything he's put up in cyberspace still stays there. And it's really hard for anyone else to shut it down. Really hard. So this got big around the year 2000, roughly, second millennium. And let me just point out that through all of recorded history and back into prehistory, this was impossible for humans to do. You could argue that, yes, you could publish a book, but to publish a book, you had to find an agent, you had to find a publisher, you had to make it through the filter, who had good judgment about what books should or shouldn't be published, et cetera, et cetera. So you can play that out. I'm sure you've heard those kinds of things before. But now the tool for connecting up to anybody is in practically anybody's hands. The cell phone more and more is becoming the tool of choice, in particular as you go down toward the so-called bottom of the pyramid, where people don't have access to laptops and full keyboards. They may not be literate, but they're getting connected. And these little filaments of connection are the avenues for future communication. One of the things that's happening there is that all these barriers are being breached, and we are actually renegotiating the social contract. So you can read Rousseau, you can read Hobbes, you can read Locke, you can read whoever you want, and they all have ideas about why we have a Marx and so forth. They all have ideas about why we have a social contract and what that social contract might be. Usually, the social contract is about avoiding chaos, avoiding the mob. By the way, the word democracy, until the middle of the 19th century, was a pejorative term. It was a bad word. It usually meant the tyranny of the majority, right? So what we're doing now is figuring out how else might this social contract work, and in very tiny ways, out of the political view mostly, in sort of at the grassroots, really getting things done. People are starting to figure out, do I trust you or do I not? And how do you and I figure out how to take over our neighborhood and get that crack house taken over and bought and painted and dressed up really nicely so we can stop this crime wave that's moving toward us, because we actually pulled data that was in that we forced into the public domain. We looked at a map and we noticed that the crime was moving toward us. So how do we figure out how to do that? How do we collectively build GPS-based maps of terrain in the United Kingdom? Go look at openstreetmaps.org. Collectively replacing and in fact improving on a database that the British government doesn't want to release. And now that we've done that together, that one little focused project, now we trust each other, and maybe that network is good for other sorts of things. Who knows? Who knows what? But now they know each other. So all these things are these filaments, these dendrites, these little synaptic connections between human beings, and then also between clusters of human beings, because we tend to we like packs. We like associating in groups. We have, there's the Dunbar number, there's a whole bunch of numbers that say that we sort of cluster up, but this is good in many ways. So I'm pretty optimistic about where we're going. Another one of the things that's happening as we pierce the barriers that used to keep society in place in a lot of ways is that we're rebalancing the left and the right brain. So I'm going to continue a little bit on this global brain metaphor. And I will submit to you that we've been subject to about a 5,000 plus year left brain overdose. It's sort of a male testosterone overdose too. And that the systems and institutions that we live in today and take for granted today are all designed sort of by engineers who don't have much knowledge of social dynamics and of what makes people actually connect to each other and what makes people have emotion and connect and trust and all those sorts of things. So our educational system, our political system, consumer mass marketing, all these sorts of things that we go, oh my God, they're changing. Well, yeah, they were all kind of designed to prevent the worst of us from becoming the mob, and then also to know how to command and control, to know how to structure these things. Our compulsory education system is an excellent example of this. So in fact, now we're starting to rebalance this. So you saw Micha point out sort of it used to be top-down, now it's many-to-many. All these sorts of things are signs of the great rebalancing. We are, in fact, right now in the middle of what I would call a Cambrian explosion of creativity. There's just this enormous amount of experimentation. The cost of experimenting in this funny little geek medium has fallen to nothing. It used to be you wanted to start a tech company and write some software. You had to buy servers and rent some space and pay people and have lots of salaried employees and start a company and get some venture funding. And if you got venture funding, that meant you had to pay them back 20 times over in 5 years, and all that stuff is gone. On your credit card and a couple other people's credit cards, you can start a really viable service. It will only get future funding if the curve of usability actually starts moving up before you ask for the funding. It's very, very interesting. The cost of playing in this and experimenting has fallen to nothing. So we're getting all these creative little mix-ups. If you're interested in Twitter, which is this funny little instant messaging thing, go look at twitterholic.com and then go read all the different things that people are riffing on Twitter because the data is just publicly available. There's one thing after another. You can do Twitter vision and see where people are tweeting around the world as they tweet all these funny little things. So we're in this Cambrian explosion of creativity, and part of what's happening looks really foolish and looks like exhaust data. Part of it is really substantive, but is mostly out of the public view because it's kind of boring. It's people actually meeting and making decisions and figuring out how to trust each other. It doesn't make the news because there's no blood, there's no violence. So I think there's probably 20 to 30 years to go, and then we might reach another point of stability. Sort of, I believe in this punctuated equilibrium theory of history where things are stable for a while and then something happens and then we wind up in a different direction. And when something happens, there's a big sort of loop, and you get a reaction, then you get an abreaction, you get backlash, then you get more, and then things settle into some new vector. Things are different before and after that equilibrium, that shift in equilibrium point. One of the things that happens at major changes is that you get gaps. So one of the nifty things to do right now, and I think part of what Pete was explaining, is that there are technology gaps where one group understands something sooner and better than somebody else does. So they leap on it and they take advantage of it, and it wins them advantage in the near term. And this is happening now in the political realm, and as we talk about all the different ways that this is happening, I think you can see that gaps are being exploited and people are figuring out, oh my God, I need to do this in a new way, and suddenly for no money I can get $5 million in a day, $10 million in a day, or whatever else. I'm really hopeful that the $3 billion campaign, I don't understand what we're doing pumping $3 billion into TV. It just blows my mind that that could even happen, that we're going to fuel the TV industry in order to elect somebody. So I'm really hopeful that all these inexpensive ways of communicating and linking and joining and linking arms and figuring things out socially will actually take over, and that the TV budget for the campaign in 2050 is $18.96. There are also these funny hiccups that happen along the way. So in 1981, I remember exchanging files and playing an online game with a reporter, except we had communicated one-to-one over dial-up using Kermit and other funny little technical protocols. And I thought, soon everybody will be doing this. And then in 1991, I watched as the fax just went whipping on by. And in 1991, if your organization didn't have a fax, your organization didn't exist. You couldn't close a deal because nobody could fax you a contract, et cetera, right? I'm like, fax, really stupid. You get a piece of paper at the other end, you then have to retype. And in 2001, the internet shows up, and now we're exchanging documents, and we sort of get back to what I thought was happening in '81, but there was this really big detour. So there's not only detours, but sometimes there's huge unintended consequences. And something that's done for one reason shows up in a different way that's not just different, it's vile and horrifying. So Galileo was under military contract to take these lens thingies and make a telescope so that we could look at the military people on the other side of that hill and get more intelligence. Then he turned the thing upward and started telling us that the skies were different than we thought they were. And the people who believed what was happening in the field over there when they looked through the telescope that-a-way thought he was lying when he pointed the telescope up and showed them stars and galaxies. They couldn't conceive that what he was showing them was actually true. Okay? So these things are mental blockbusters, and it's okay, just listen. If you feel your gut just rise or your throat just constrict when you hear something that sounds like way outlandish, sit with that for a little while, because it could be that that's the stars, right? So part of what's happening now is that we're rethinking also things that we throw around here as if they were normal and everyday things and will stay the same forever. One of them is journalism, and one of them is government. And I tend to refer to small g governance these days instead of big G government. And I'm a big fan of governance, in particular self-governance, and I don't mean just me for me, but I mean people collecting together and figuring out how do we govern ourselves now that we can communicate. And I'll point you here to Clay Shirky's new book, Here Comes Everybody. It's a beautifully written book, very, very accessible, quick run through the kinds of forces that are at hand right now that are allowing us to connect up in ways that a mere decade ago, we couldn't do. So one of the things he does early in the book is he compares airline strandings, basically passengers stuck on the tarmac for 8 or 9 hours. And 14 years ago, there was an incident that Northwest Airlines basically waited out. 4 years ago, there was an incident that was roughly the same duration on an airplane, except one of the passengers got off, got really mad, and then went on the net and started finding who were the other passengers. Before you know it, she had 30,000 people signed up, and Congress passed a passenger's Bill of Rights. And Clay is suggesting that the difference between the two incidents, really, the major difference, is that today we're beginning to have these tools to get together and do stuff, which I think is awesome. And I'm generally optimistic about this. I tend to be pessimistic in the short run because I know about all these little highways, byways, gaps that taken advantage of, the politics and so forth that happens in between. And to me, politics is a derogatory term. So I know that we're here in the middle talking about politics as if it's a good thing and as if all this money going into TV is a good thing. To me, this is the exception to the rule, and we're hopefully going to get past this. And we'll figure out by the way, direct democracy, nobody really knows what it is. Everybody's scared shitless of it. Democrats are scared to death of it. Republicans are scared to death of it. Nobody really knows what direct democracy is. It's a frightful kind of term. So we're going to figure something out, and I'm not quite sure what it is, but it has all these bits of evidence around all of this. So journalism is changing deeply and dramatically. We talk about how the blogosphere affects mainstream media and so on and backwards and forwards. And mainstream media is defeating itself. It's basically had so many incidents now of lack of credibility and sort of destroying itself. I think what begins to happen is that journalism is going to start to split. We're going to get investigative journalism. The Cy Hirsch's, the Lowell Bergmans, and other sorts of people, and they need to be funded. We need to figure out how to take investigative reporters and editors and give them lots of money and make sure they live forever. The mainstream media kind of flutters and flounders and sort of kills itself through destroying its own credibility and being owned by people like Berlusconi. And then the grassroots, the netroots, the whatever else, slowly figures out whom to trust, how to trust them by building these little dendritic connections and building this global brain and pointing to mainstream media stuff when it's good and when it's authentic and when it's real, and then outing it when it's not. And nobody can necessarily be trusted just because they're there. You learn to trust people over time. We forget about the role of time because we're accustomed to the old style model where you launch a new product by buying a lot of media and saying, trust me, trust me. And that's not what's happening right now. You trust people because they did something good for quite a long period of time. So that's all I wanted to put on the table, and let's get to some questions. Thank you.